Hi everyone, this is Dr. Mike, host of the free iTunes podcast, Psychiatric Secrets Revealed with Dr. Mike, but that's not why I'm here today. This is another Saving Savvy episode, and this is actually a Photography 101 episode, and I'm going to talk about what happens when you overexpose your pictures. And we're talking especially about outdoor pictures today. So recently we celebrated Easter in our household. That's a Christian holiday where you celebrate rebirth. And so I had a camera out and I was taking all sorts of pictures and this is I'm not a professional photographer. I call myself an amateur enthusiast that sometimes does work, maybe a semi professional. And so I was taking lots of pictures and my family likes it because I post those pictures on Facebook. So let me share with you a few of them and I'll show you what happened. Well, of course, we have the traditional coloring of the Easter eggs, and these look fine. And we always have some special breakfast on Easter morning. And of course, there's a Easter egg hunt, which is always a lot of fun. Even though my kids are now older, they still want to go on that hunt. And when I go to family functions, I wind up taking all sorts of family photos, like these. But what happened here? Beautiful family, but they're tremendously overexposed. And overexposed to a level that I really couldn't even correct this. Maybe it was in a RAW, but I don't think I would even be able to correct this if this was a RAW file. Here's another one. Here I am with my wife and two of my kids. Overexposed, unusable. And here's another one. Overexposed. Now, interestingly, when I converted this one to black and white, and I upped the black levels and the contrast a bit, I did get this interesting photo. They kind of look like they're glowing, which I kind of like, but it certainly wasn't the intention of my shot. So let me get out of there. And so how does that happen? So I thought what I would do is generally talk about what do you do when you have overexposed pictures, and then I'll share with you what I did wrong. I did a couple things wrong, but I'll share with you those things at the end. So the first thing that you should do is look at the photo after you take it. So when I see individuals like professional photographers, they're always like looking and taking photos again and making sure everything is okay. Now that was very difficult for me to do because it was very bright outside, but I could have done it. And even though I couldn't see, even though I couldn't see the picture, I could have at least looked at the histogram. Most better cameras will allow you to look at the histogram of a picture. And usually that tells you the distribution between the blacks and the whites, the tonal range. And typically a perfectly exposed picture will have a nice even curve here. If it's all leaning towards the black, it's probably underexposed. If it's all leaning towards the white, it's probably overexposed. And you can usually see the histogram under even bad lighting conditions. So how can you correct an overexposed image or even an underexposed one? Well, first we gotta go to our famous exposure triangle. The ISO, which is sort of the gain on the sensor, used to be the film speed. The aperture, or how wide the little blades on the lens are open, letting in more light or less light. And the shutter speed, how long the shutter is open. Obviously, the higher the ISO, the more sensitive the sensor is to light. So if things are overexposed, you can always turn down the ISO to a lower number. Same thing with the aperture. The wider the aperture, the more light's coming in. You can always turn down that aperture to let less light in, but sometimes you want that aperture wide open because you want to blur the background. And I'll tell you how to handle that in a minute too. Same thing with the shutter speed. The longer the shutter is opened, the more light comes in, and so you can make that shutter speed instead of maybe 1/200th of a second, maybe 1/400th of a second, or 1/800th of a second. Less light hits the sensor, and you would make that overexposed picture underexposed. But here again, I mentioned to you, what would you do if you were in a situation where maybe you wanted that aperture wide open and you really couldn't adjust the other parameters to get the right exposure? Well, you could reduce the amount of light entering the camera by using a filter, like a neutral density filter. And there are filters that you can adjust how dark they are or how bright they are. They're called adjustable neutral density filters. Or if you have a polarizing filter, you can use that too, because that will cut down the light that enters the sensor. Let's say you had an exposure where you had, or a picture where you had a very bright sky, but yet if you expose for the sky, the scenery would be underexposed, but if you expose for the scenery, the sky would be blown out. Well, that's when you use things like HDR, or high dynamic range. Many cameras, even simple point and shoots, will have an HDR mode where it does that automatically. Obviously, this is better for situations where you have stationary objects, not moving objects, because usually what the camera is going to do is take several shots and combine them together, several shots at different exposures. So you can do this in software by taking several similar shots at different exposures, or cameras will often do this, but HDR is a possibility. Well, what else could you do? Well, let's say you wanted to expose that sky properly, but otherwise the people were a little dark. Well, you can slightly underexpose the picture by maybe a half a stop or even a stop. And even in a JPEG image, you can often bring out those midtones well enough so the picture looks quite nice. So underexposing a bit to kind of give you a full dynamic range can also make a difference. Well, what happens if you don't want to do that? Well, here's two completely opposite solutions. You can shoot the picture in automatic, the little green dot on your camera, or in RAW. Now, automatic, they sound like the opposite, but they're kind of going to give you similar sorts of impacts. So automatic, the camera's brain's going to take over, and it's going to adjust all the parameters and give you a proper exposure. Now, it may blow out the sky in preference to your subject, but that might be okay with you. RAW gives you a raw bag of data, and so you're going to have a lot more latitude when it comes to adjusting the various highlights and midtones and blacks. So you might be able to use RAW. So what else can you do? Well, what else can you do wrong? You could do what I did wrong. So in those shots that you saw, what I did was I was trying to use a fill flash, but I forgot that I was in aperture priority mode. And so I had my aperture wide open because I really wanted to blur the background. And that was fine as long as the camera could adjust a shutter speed to compensate for that big wide aperture, so it could shoot maybe at a faster shutter speed. When I used my flash, I defaulted to the flash sync speed, which is 1/200th of a second. So at 1/200th of a second, with a flash, and with the camera dropping its ISO to 100, which is the lowest it would go, it was still way too overexposed. So that was an operator error, not a camera error, and I kind of screwed up a couple of pictures. Luckily, I wasn't getting paid for those pictures, and the people that I took the pictures of were very understanding. So those are some clues on what to do when you have overexposed pictures. Sometimes it's your error, sometimes you just need to adjust something. Sometimes you need to go automatic, sometimes you need to go more manual and raw. Take care, everyone, and if you get a chance, please give my podcast a listen. It's called Psychiatric Secrets Revealed with Dr. Mike. You can find it on iTunes and other podcatching sites. And if you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. And boy, I'd really appreciate it if you would subscribe too. Bye-bye.